Good? I'm good.
And get started. Should we get started?
Yes, we might as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. We have Duncan here. He's going to be speaking about ransomware, a declining threat in today's landscape. Brad, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. So if you guys have read my bio, you probably know I work at Palo Alto Networks for the Unit 42 Threat Intelligence team. We're the public face of threat research for Palo Alto Networks. So while we have other people within the company that do threat research to support the product, to support the customers, the few members that we have on the Unit 42 team are specifically tasked with giving back to the community, and this is part of what we do. So today I'm going to talk about the declining threat of ransomware. It's still a threat. It's still an issue that we need to take very, very seriously. It's just not as pervasive as it has been in the past 2 or 3 years. And that is something that the media doesn't really tend to cover. So first we're going to look at the current state of ransomware as of, say, the full month of January 2017 as we're going into February here. Ransomware history, so we can kind of understand where we came from, why we're at where we're at right now, reasons for the relative decline in what we've been seeing with ransomware, and how it's still a serious threat even though it's reduced from what it was. I don't think I would probably be insulting your guys' intelligence to describe ransomware for you. If you're here, you probably already know what ransomware is about. The thing with ransomware, reporting on ransomware is an issue with journalism in general, is that we need to tell a compelling story in order to hook the viewer or the listener or the reader, right? So as we're doing this, we're playing up the sensational aspects of whatever issue is being reported on, right? Somebody could talk about the shooting in the Florida school that happened just this past week, right? So you get kind of a skewed perspective on, in that example, safety in our actual educational system, where that event is not representative of everything as a whole. And that's kind of what we see with ransomware, where you'll get stories of high-profile attacks, and they don't really represent the ground truth overall on what's going on in the malware field. Now, the problem with ransomware and reporting about statistics is statistics are it's kind of hard to come by reliable statistics. I can tell you from personal anecdotes that I'm seeing far less ransomware now than I used to see a year ago. But that doesn't provide any hard data. So where do we get our data from? People that do research and look into this sort of thing. One of the public tools, I say public, but this is a very expensive paid-for service provided by my employer, is Virustotal Intelligence. Okay, the average person does not have access to Virustotal Intelligence, although we can look up a file hash on Virustotal and find out what Virustotal says it is, according to the antivirus vendors that are submitting their information on a particular piece of malware, right? Now, with Virustotal Intelligence, those people that have that could actually grab the samples of the malware that were submitted to Virustotal. So, and there are a few other functions that you can actually use to kind of search and actually find some interesting things through Virustotal Intelligence that you would never be able to find through Virustotal itself. But this is a very powerful tool for security researchers to find new malware and to kind of get an idea of what's out there on a day-to-day basis. As a threat researcher at Palo Alto Networks, I also got access to our particular threat intelligence tool, AutoFocus, where I can grab samples, I can grab information on samples across our entire customer base. Now, this is not a unique thing to my employer. It's any major security vendor has some sort of threat intelligence service where they can get information like this. But this is another source of information that I can pull into, to tap into, to kind of get an idea on what's out there. The problem with both Virustotal Intelligence and a particular vendor's threat intelligence platform is that the samples that are submitted sometimes are not exactly the time that they were discovered in the wild. Right? So let's say I'm a customer, or I run across some malware I submitted to Virustotal, but I've had it sitting in my queue for about a month before I get around to looking at it, and I figured, oh, I'll submit it to Virustotal, and then a researcher like me is looking at it and thinking, oh, they first saw it 30 days after it actually first appeared in the wild. Now, this is interesting because a lot of malware samples, they mutate, they evolve. The way that they are presented is they're changed a few bytes at a time, and as a result, the same piece of malware could have, several dozen or maybe 100 different hashes over the course of a day or a week or a month or however long it's out there. So in one case, a good example of this is on Virustotal. About a couple of months ago, somebody was submitting samples of server ransomware that had not been submitted for, they were back in 2016, and we started seeing this at the end of 2017. Somebody was telling me over Twitter that, hey, we're seeing some new samples of server. And I thought, that's odd. Server disappeared back in May. So, or May or June or whenever it was during the summer. So I started looking at it, and I realized that these samples acted exactly like server did when it first appeared back in 2016. And I thought that's odd, but it's not really that odd because somebody was getting around to submitting their queue of unanalyzed malware samples. They were just dumping it into Virustotal. That's how I viewed it as happening. Somebody else was saying, well, maybe somebody's trying to misdirect us intentionally. And I thought, it's possible, but I don't think it's likely. I think it's just an unfortunate circumstance of people submitting stuff. So as a result, it is sometimes you got to take your data with a grain of salt when you're looking at even relatively well-established sources of information on malware. Another source, which is a little bit more timely, is Twitter, where you can look for certain hashtags or certain terms and kind of get a better idea on when you're seeing stuff. Now, another source, because I document it so frequently, so if we look at January 2017 compared to January 2018, this is a very good way to tell you what's happened with ransomware in general over the course of a year. So on my blog, where I would do blog posts usually once every day, at least once every weekday, we're seeing a lot of ransomware, mostly server. So if you go to my blog at malware-traffic-analysis.net, you'll see plenty of samples of server ransomware in January 2017, and some of the other ransomware that was active during that time as well. If you go to January 2018 and you look at the examples I have there, there is hardly any ransomware at all. In fact, the only ransomware you'll see on my blog for January 2018 are some examples of Gand Crab ransomware that popped up near the end of the month. So I can tell you from an anecdotal perspective that I'm not seeing ransomware like I used to. I used to just couldn't get away from it. The vast majority of stuff that I was running across on mass distribution was ransomware, ransomware, ransomware. I couldn't get away from it. It drove me crazy because I was hoping for one information stealer, one banking Trojan or something that would add a little bit of spice to the stuff that I was running into. Now I've kind of got the other issue. I'm running into a lot of information stealers, banking Trojans, malware downloaders, typical stuff, and not as much ransomware. But I'm looking at it from a mass distribution perspective. I'm not looking at the targeted attacks. I'm not looking at the, in general, I'm not looking at the targeted attacks or the limited distribution methods. We'll kind of get into that. But what I was able to do is go through my employer's autofocus tool and grab samples of ransomware. Now, what I have on this chart here is the samples of ransomware that we've run across of the various families, and these are individual file hashes. So while they may be examples of the same malware, just a few bytes off from each other, this is the number of unique samples that we've seen in January 2017 compared to January 2018. Roughly about half. Right? And I was kind of surprised because we're actually seeing a lot, from my side, I was seeing far less. But that's what we've seen, taking into account that some of these samples may have been submitted a few months after the fact. Now, if we look at session data, this is where we're talking about emails, web sessions, people submitting samples to our wildfire malware analysis tool. Any of that stuff counts as a session when I'm searching through our autofocus threat platform to get a better idea. Now here we're looking at a 3-to-1 ratio. We had 3 times as many more sessions involving ransomware in January 2017 than we did in January 2018. So definitely it is a marked decline. It backs up what I've seen on my own, just in general research, that yes, we've seen a noticeable, very distinct decline in ransomware, and I've got some numbers that will actually back up my personal observations. But as I said earlier, I generally deal in broad distribution, non-targeted attacks, mass distribution over a wide range, and normally that happens through malicious spam, right? Just stuff that's spammed out there, and like the vast majority of it gets caught by an organization's spam filters, right? So if you're working as a security professional in your organization and you're not reviewing what's getting, somehow having some sort of review or oversight of what's getting caught in your spam filters, you're not getting a good idea of what's out there on a day-to-day basis, the stuff that's getting bounced off your organization. Because some of those could very well be targeted attacks, and you never know because you're not looking at the stuff that's getting hit by your spam filters. Yes, sir?
Clients do tracking the Bitcoin transactions, they're tracking those, and actually identifying the addresses.
That may be.
Preferred method of payments.
That is true. Bitcoin itself is supposed to ensure anonymous transactions, but we know that that stuff can be tracked. Some of the ransomware, like Server, would have a unique Bitcoin address for each infection, which I thought was rather interesting. They started out with just one Bitcoin address per wave of ransomware, and then they turned around. It was like every single infection that I did was a different Bitcoin address, which made it much harder to actually track the criminals. But regardless, Server, it's interesting. If we look at Server disappeared sometime in the summer of last year, so it's gone. Locky, the last time I saw a Locky sample in the wild was November of last year. So I'm saying, I'm calling it here if nobody else has called it, Locky is gone. So what I've seen mostly in the past few months up until January has been Globe Impostor ransomware. Now this is a much less sophisticated ransomware because let's face it, it's exceedingly easy for criminals, once they have access to elevated permissions in your computer, or they have access to the malware is actually running on your computer, it's relatively easy to encrypt your data and throw a message up there saying, hey, your stuff has been encrypted, email me, and we'll discuss how you can get your files back. In this case, they show a little web page, and you can go to kind of a Tor-based website that acts as a middleman. But it's far less exciting. Globe Impostor is there's been a few variants that have gone out through the past few months. But the last time I saw a globe impostor sample that I can confirm in the wild was on the 22nd of January. I used to be seeing these every single day back in December, every single weekday, when the waves of malicious spam would be going out. But we do see limited distribution or targeted attacks. Now, the thing with those is normally those channels are not something that that as a researcher for Palo Alto Networks that I have much visibility into. For example, SAMSA or SamSam. There may be a couple of other names for this ransomware, but this is generally, the way I understand it, is distributed by people compromising servers, web servers, whatever is connected to the internet, and then they drop SAMSA ransomware on it, and they encrypt the files on the server, and the companies need to pay big money to get this information back. Now, there's been definitely some news in the past year or so about SAMSA attacks. This started back in 2016, I think, if I remember correctly. And there is a timeline where I'll show that it appeared in 2016. But the last sample that I can confirm of SAMSA ransomware is January 31st, which actually makes sense because this sort of comes and goes in waves. It's not consistent. We'll see some news about SAMSA, and then you'll definitely check on Virustotal, and you'll find that there are some SAMSA samples out there that have been submitted by companies that have been targeted by these attacks. It's limited distribution, though. So the samples that I've been able to find are either targeted to Linux or the Windows samples I haven't been able to successfully infect in an environment, but I haven't really set up any Windows servers to actually really test it out. WannaCry is one that's, I wouldn't call mass distribution, but we see samples of this out in the wild nearly every day. And when I was checking last week in compiling this slideshow, and I checked this morning, I was still seeing samples up through, I think it was yesterday. Right? And so WannaCry, what was it, May, I think, April or May or June or sometime during this past summer is when it first appeared. This is notable in that it propagates through an exploit that was stolen by the shadow brokers from the NSA, propagating through SMB, the Microsoft's SMB protocol. And basically, if you got your SMB open to the internet, you are at risk of getting infected by WannaCry. But I found this is interesting because you don't really hear that much news about WannaCry in the public media anymore. But we're still certainly seeing samples that my employer's tools are definitely identifying as WannaCry in such a consistent flow that it doesn't seem like people are submitting this stuff months after the fact. So, and I can corroborate with the information on Virustotal Intelligence that yes, these were not seen any earlier in the wild unless people are purposely submitting them months after the fact. And my gut feeling is that's not the case here. Does anybody recognize this pattern? So instead of yellow on a background, how about white on a red background? And you've got the infamous Petya, not Petya, whatever Kaspersky or anybody is calling it nowadays. The stuff that we're finding that that's coming across identified as Petya is actually a variant that now calls itself GoldenEye. So on this one, instead of what you see with a lot of ransomwares, you get a web window or a text file pop up that says your files have been infected. This is one of those boot sector ransomware deals where the whole computer is locked out and your files are still encrypted, but it literally calls itself GoldenEye. And this is the type of not Petya variant family, whatever it is, morphed into now that we're seeing nowadays. Which is interesting because you'll see a lot of, this past week there's been a lot of headlines that have been going around about the fact that, was it the U.S. government was saying that the NotPetya outbreak of earlier this year last year, during the summer of 2017, was attributed to the Russians. So I got a lot of headlines, right? So we're seeing a lot of news about that, and if you weren't as informed as most of us in this room are, you would think that, there must be some more NotPetya out there right now, but that's not the case. It's whatever variant that GoldenEye is of NotPetya. But the only other one that I'm seeing now is something I'd mentioned earlier that I'm seeing is Gand Crab ransomware. Now, this is interesting. Interesting fact about Gand Crab is I wrote a SANS ISC diary about some Gand Crab ransomware I was seeing, and I just made an offhanded sentence. It's like, well, this seems to be taking the place of, previous families like Lockheed and Cerber and whatnot. And then somebody informed me that, hey, on the criminal underground forums advertising Gand Crab, they quoted you and they cited your name. And that was the quote that they used, that it apparently has taken the place of some of these previous ransomware families, taking it totally out of context, saying that, number one, I don't consider this any more effective or any more advanced than any of the previous ransomware families that we'd seen. And number two, that I did a tweet that stated that Gand is India slang for butt, so you might hear me refer to it as butt crab ransomware. But butt crab is not something that I see in general all over the place, although it does tend to use some, we've seen it through exploit kits, which are not anything I consider mass distribution anymore, just because of their limited effectiveness in today's environment. And we've seen it from some these Hoffler text pop-ups that I've blogged about before, which is just fake font plugin advertisements, and they'll say, if you want to see this website properly, install this. And the file's always named font_chrome.exe. And for the longest time, it was sending, last year it was sending ransomware. The last half of last year, it was sending some sort of remote access tool. And then as of about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we started seeing Gand Crab from this campaign. But we're still seeing some examples of limited distribution of ransomware. This is one from this past week, Saturn Ransomware. Has anybody read about that on Bleeping Computer? $300, which is a bargain compared to some of the extortion that these guys will generally tend to do. But let's look at ransomware history to kind of understand why we're at where we're at right now. Yes, sir.
As far as percentages, I know there was a time where you paid the ransom, you might not have gotten your data back. But can you give a percentage of how often you pay and get your fees and how often you make bill?
Gotcha. The question was, do I have a percentage of any information on the percentage of people who have paid ransom and have not gotten their files back? Unfortunately, I don't have that data. That would definitely be anecdotal, and I don't know anybody that's specifically collecting that. Just by the very nature of the people who do pay are probably not proud to advertise the fact. So I can guarantee you that many companies out there that are paying, they're going to try and keep that as quiet as possible, unless you're a big healthcare conglomerate. Or government service that for some reason, at the local or state level that has to pay. You'll get a news article about it showing where your tax money is going. So I'm sure you guys all remember AIDS, which was all the rage back in the early to late 80s. So AIDS is a form of ransomware where this was I won't say pre-internet, but pre-web. So long before the web was very popular, AIDS educational material was distributed through snail mail on 5 1/4-inch floppy disks. And eventually, once you ran this stuff, your computer screen would be locked. Somewhat similar to the NotPetya example we saw earlier. In this case, you would send a money order, $189, which I guess in today's dollars would be a little more closer to the $300 to $400 that we see, for some of the more bargain basement ransomware payments. And you would mail it to PC Cyborg Corporation in Panama. And I was talking to somebody earlier that had mentioned that they had looked into the person behind this that had gotten caught. And that is something now that I know that the person behind this had gotten caught. It was a very interesting story, and I wouldn't do it justice by repeating it here.
And he was a physician, wasn't he?
I believe so. I believe he was working for the World Health Organization. And, just crazy. So, the first modern wave of ransomware happened about the time that the web started getting a bit more pervasive in everybody's lives. The web definitely existed well before 2005. However, 2005 was about the time that we started seeing ransomware that appeared in vaguely the same form as we recognize it today, where people would be asking for ransom for you to get your data back. But it's still kind of nebulous, still kind of not quite the form that we see today. In 2008, we started seeing fake antivirus, which to me doesn't necessarily equate to ransomware on a personal level, but it's the same general concept, where your computer is told that it's infected. So you're not saying, I'm going to hold your files for ransom. You're saying that, in this case, this is a sample I published in 2014 called the Windows Anti-Breach Module. And so your fake antivirus window will pop up. And in this case, it would tell me that my bank account details are being sent to whatever IP addresses it found in regular web traffic that was happening on my computer at the time. So this happened in my lab in 2014. And interestingly enough, it told me that some of my VMware tools were apparently malware. And then it tells you got to activate. Got to activate this so you can actually clean your computer. And you've got 3 options to choose from here. Default is a lifetime license for just under $100 US. So, interestingly enough, I never was able to get data on, if people actually paid this, if their credit card information wasn't already in the hands of criminals, if they entered it, using this malware. A couple of years later, by 2011, we started seeing locker ransomware. This is another example from 2014 in my home lab. And notice how President Obama at the time was looking very disappointed in you. All right. Apparently, the infected host was looking at child pornography, or actually, in this case, I think it was just regular pornography, which, pardon me, I don't think is legal if you just look at pornography on your computer. If it was, I figure a lot of America would be in jail. In this case, you're looking at, this is before Bitcoin became prevalent. You would have to do a money pack or a MoneyGram, go to your local CVS or Walmart or someplace to actually, pay your $300 to $400, whatever they were asking. So, in this case, your computer screen was locked. You couldn't access your files. You could log in, but you couldn't access your files. Here's another one from the supposedly from the FBI. This one is real interesting because it accuses you of child pornography, and as if to back it up, it actually has some images that I blacked out that were of child pornography. So this was a rather disgusting example that I ran across in my lab environment. It was, interestingly enough, it would take whatever IP address you were coming from at the time, and it would tell you, okay, here are some of the fake URLs. You didn't know that they were fake, but of child porn sites that you were looking at. But so that was so I saw those up through 2014 when we started seeing a better more developed waves of ransomware. In 2012, we started seeing the prevalence of fake antivirus for the Android. This one's the Android Defender that came up around 2012 or so. Now, Android ransomware remains stuck at the locker-style ransomware. All right, so you're not going to get messages on your Android phone or tablet or television saying, go to this website to get your instructions and make this Bitcoin payment. Bitcoin may still be involved, but you're looking at various different types of ransomware that will basically lock your screen. And that's really all you need to do on an Android phone, apparently. So I guess for practical reasons, Android hasn't developed past the locker style of ransomware. CryptoLocker appeared in 2013, which was the mainly distributed through email, but it was the first highly effective ransomware. It was when we first started seeing Bitcoin used in ransomware. About $400 was the cost, and there was no Tor pages involved at this time. They hadn't gotten to that point yet, and that was killed during the takedown of the Zeus botnet. But I can remember running across a few samples of this in my studies, in my research. Now I've highlighted this CryptoWall in 2014 because with CryptoWall is when we finally saw all of the modern elements of ransomware fall into place. With CryptoWall, we start seeing the Tor pages as part of a sophisticated network backend. Since CryptoWall came out, there has really been no significant advances in the way ransomware, at least Windows-based ransomware, has evolved. We're still stuck at the CryptoWall level, which is probably a good thing, right? Because how many people have seen predictions that the next few years are going to be see an increase of ransomware, and like 2018 will be the year of ransomware. 2018 will be the year of coin miners. So I'll still see articles that will tout the dangerousness of ransomware as if it were still as pervasive today as it was a year ago, and that's simply not the case. But ransomware has not evolved past this, past what was established with CryptoWall. There have been little bells and whistles added, but the basic building blocks, the way ransomware works on a Windows computer anyway, has not really basically changed since CryptoWall in 2014. This is kind of a stagnation of what we've seen. It was very exciting at the time. But with each development that we've seen in Windows ransomware, we haven't really seen anything that's improved upon it. So KeyRanger in 2016 we saw, it was actually, if I understand things correctly, one of my fellow researchers at Palo Alto Networks that found an example of ransomware for the Mac, for Apple's OS X, or Mac OS now I guess it's called. So in this case, nothing particularly tricky here. Somebody had compromised the site that distributes transmission, which is a BitTorrent client for the Mac. So they basically you would install this and then get infected with ransomware. So they somehow embedded ransomware into the program, and I think there was probably about a day, 24-hour window or so where this was available to the public, and I don't know how many people actually got infected with it, but it was taken down relatively quick. But this is the first instance that I know of verified Mac ransomware. 2016, as I mentioned earlier, was when SAMHSA first appeared, so I really can't add anything more here. WannaCry in 2017, as I already went over, that added propagation methods, which is not unique. A propagation method is not really what I consider ransomware. It's just a part of how this specific ransomware was propagated. It doesn't act any differently once you're infected than happened with CryptoWall. wall. And then, of course, GandCrab, and the only thing that GandCrab did was say, hey, I'm going to use a different cryptocurrency other than Bitcoin because Bitcoin is too volatile, and we'll use something called Dash, which is a little more stable, apparently. We'll see how that plays out for the makers of ButtCrab. So what are the reasons for the decline? Anybody got any ideas? How about the volatility of Bitcoin? So as 2017 started, when we still saw plenty of examples of ransomware every day, Bitcoin had kind of stabilized around $100. It had been kind of slowly rising throughout 2016, but it was never the cluster of ups and downs that you see towards the end of the year. And it actually got, I forget what the highest value it was, but it was like $18,000 or $19,000 US dollars. And then it settled at 13,860 at the end of the year. And it always cracked me up when I would hear somebody or see a news article that said, oh, Bitcoin has dropped, to $1,200. And, they're saying that as if Bitcoin had somehow completely devalued. And it's like, no, it just dropped a few $100 compared to, and once again, this is journalism 101, where you're trying to put a compelling spin on a story to make it more attention-grabbing and more readable. Somehow, it ends up distorting the ground truth of the situation. But so you have Bitcoin volatility, which cryptocurrency has been the primary method of payment for ransomware since 2014, 2013. You got a lack of innovation. There really isn't, we're not seeing any new innovations, and it should be interesting to see what the next couple of years bring. Because I imagine if there's something that we're not foreseeing as a security community that the criminals are able to implement into ransomware, maybe we'll see another surge. Windows is generally more secure now than it was, back in, what's the right way to phrase this? I know you guys are all big fans of Windows 10, but Windows 10 is definitely more secure than Windows 7. Regardless of how many people don't like the UI, underneath, there's definitely a bunch of more security baked into the operating system. And so as a result, in a lot of us in our lab environments, we're still using Windows 7 64-bit to infect our computers because it's much easier. You don't have some of the Windows Defender pop-ups or whatever Windows 10 is using. And it is very hard for me, comparatively speaking, to infect a Windows 10 host compared to a Windows 7 host. And Windows 10 is definitely seeing more adoption as the weeks and the months go by. I think now they said finally Windows 10 within the last month or two has finally reached parity or past adoption of Windows 7. Market share, I guess it's more than Windows 7 now. And some people are still sticking with Vista and XP. Windows is less prevalent now than it used to be, right? This is an issue with malware in general, but if you look at the market share with the rise of mobile computing and tablets, you're seeing a lot more people use their Android tablets or phones to work on their Apple phones and their Apple tablets. You can do a lot of stuff now on those that you wouldn't have thought about doing 5 years ago. So in that time, we're seeing a lot less Windows attack surface, I guess for lack of a better term, that the criminals who generally make Windows malware out there trying to mass distribute this stuff. And people are more prepared. So if there is an upside to the way that journalists tend to report ransomware and sensationalize it, for lack of a better term, is that we, as definitely as a security community, but the population in general is more aware of ransomware and more likely to understand that they need to back up their data. and they're less liable to pay the ransom. So ransomware itself is still a threat, so we're still seeing stuff out there. As I noted earlier, in the current state of ransomware, we're still seeing the GoldenEye variant of NotPetya. We're still seeing WannaCry out there, new samples every day. We're still seeing new examples of ransomware that are still stuck at the crypto wall level or even less advanced that are being emailed out there. It's still a profitable business model. It's just not being pushed out there or as pervasive as it used to be. If you get hit with ransomware now, it's really no different than if you got hit with ransomware 5 years ago. Assuming it's successful, you'll still either pay to recover your data or lose it. So as recently as January, we saw the Hancock Health System, the hospital, they paid $55,000 to somebody, and I think this was SAMHSA, but I've never been able to confirm it, where they paid $55,000 to hackers. Now, the hospital did have backups, but one of the key factors in having a system backing up your data is to ensure that you could recover it in a timely fashion to maintain your business operations, and that's not what happened here. Apparently, it was easier, more profitable for the hospital to pay the ransomware criminals than to restore their data and suffer even more downtime. Mere days after that, Allscripts, a health that does, among other things, this company keeps healthcare records. They were hit with ransomware. They never specified what it was, but at least 4 days they were down. Hopefully they're back up by the time I'm speaking here, as we're here at BSides Tampa, but you never know. And this bleepingcomputer.com is a site that every Friday they will post information on under the header This Week in Ransomware. And they keep a pretty good eye on that. If you're interested in ransomware and you want to know what's going on, this is probably your best timeliest, up-to-date periodic weekly report on what's going on out there. And so if you actually look at this and read the details of yesterday's article, you'll find out that there was, I think it was 8 either new or updated variants on current ransomware families that were reported during the past week by the guy that does this, Lawrence Abrams. I think he gets most of his data from Twitter postings from various researchers in the community. But that pretty much concludes this presentation. We talked about the current state of ransomware, had some data to back up my anecdotal evidence that, yes, we're seeing a lot less ransomware now than we used to. We looked at ransomware history to see how where we're at now and some reasons for the recent decline during the past year of ransomware, and how it's a serious but reduced threat. So even though it's not as bad as it used to be, it's still something that we have to prepare just like we would for any other type of malware. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. If not, I'm certainly available. I'll be hanging around after the talk here. But yes, sir.
Do you have any sort of email accounts that you can just monitor to see if spam has any of the ransomware malware?
The question is, do I have a honeypot system? Basically, how am I getting checking to see if we're seeing it through spam, ransomware through spam, or any type of malware when it comes to that? I have a method that I'm not going to discuss publicly. It's not a honeypot, but one of the sources of information is our threat intelligence system, where we can look and see what's tagged as various types of malware that we're actually seeing that are usually blocked by customer organizations' web filters or mail filters. So we can get kind of an idea, which is where I got the numbers earlier. It was basically looking from a meta tag that we have for all the discovered ransomware samples. Sir?
And so I would guess that all of the network uses
That is true. The question was, what does Palo Alto Networks, my employer, do with the information that we're finding as far as going back into supporting the customer? And that is the job of our threat intelligence team that's internal, our global security response team, where they have researchers that basically feed that information back into product development and detection to help the customers, which is, it's the same as, I will say it's the same as any other organization that provides security services. We all feed the information that we get through our research back into our products to help our customers.
I don't know if you follow out with IDS.
Well, I tell you what, sir, I'll talk to you about that offline afterwards. I don't want to get big into the company itself because my job as a member of Unit 42 is to just promote general awareness and specific issues, not necessarily to push the product. But I will definitely be more than happy to talk to you about that afterwards. Any other questions? If not, if you have anything you want to talk about to me individually, please see me after the briefing. Thank you very much.